Hi, folks. I'm Adrian Sanabria, the host of Enterprise Security Weekly. Every week, we interview the most interesting folks we can find, talking about the most pressing cybersecurity issues and challenges facing the enterprise today. Myself and my co-hosts have each been in the industry for decades, long enough to see the patterns in the industry and explore where trends are going. In addition to enterprise challenges, we also follow the vendor space, the most interesting security startups emerging, technology and product trends, all the most interesting funding and acquisition announcements. Finally, we love to discuss the latest trends in tech and how they'll impact cybersecurity. If you're wondering how the latest in AI, quantum computing, cloud, and DevOps is going to impact security a few years down the road, you should follow the Enterprise Security Weekly podcast.
Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. We just talked with Mark Curphey and Simon Bennett about Crash Override's open source fellowship and how it will set Zappa up for a successful future. I'm your host, Mike Shima. I'm here with John Kinsella, and it's just about time for the news. But first, to ensure you don't lose access to the Security Weekly content and all the limericks you know and love, please make sure your favorite podcast feeds are up to date. Visit securityweekly.com/subscribe right now to find the buttons to subscribe for each show. And get ready for an electrifying experience at the 15th Annual Identiverse. Join over 3,000 identity professionals in Vegas on May 28th to 31st for 4 days packed with dynamic learning and collaboration. As a community member, receive 25% off your Identiverse 2024 tickets using the code IDV24-SW25. Register today at securityweekly.com/IDV2024. And that was a lot of acronyms and letters spread together, John.
Easy for you to say.
Yeah, well, it was not easy for me to say, though. We'll see how our producers, we'll see what Tyson can clean up for me, because I'm stumbling today. Just as I'm stumbling over trying to figure out how much we should continue to talk about XZ Utils or not. It's one thing to exhaust a topic, is another thing. Is there something new and different? I figured I'd pull in an article from CISA because they were basically talking, go support your open source friends. And we just talked about open source funding with Crash Override with Mark Curphey and Simon Bennett about that funding itself. So blah, blah, blah. I think what I'm just going to point out here is that the article also has a tabletop exercise. So if you want to have an example of how to walk through a tabletop exercise, go through that. And the tabletop exercise is sort of, who do you talk to? Who in your organization, if there is a supply chain vulnerability in a open source dependency, developers say it's going to take a month for it to be fixed. So you've got a month window as part of the scenario was set up. What do you do? And I thought that was maybe a kind of a way to help organizations, just rather than say, how are we going to protect ourselves from XZ Utils, or say, no, thank you to the vendors that say our tool was the only one who could find the XZ Utils flaw. Say, we've got a tabletop exercise that we're running for ourselves and we have processes in place. We don't need another marketing tool. So maybe that was the way I wanted to take that.
Yeah, interesting. I think there's you got me thinking about something else here. I think so. Love tabletop exercises. I think that's a great thing to do. We should all be doing them. Some companies have them in different ways, and maybe you do it's operational readiness before you go and release something, or it's part of your design process, or somewhere along that path. Think about doing that. I think the second part here is you're thinking through that. I was just thinking for our listeners, because I imagine someone out there going like, dude, it's not that hard. You just update XZ in your package and you keep going. And I think the second type of tabletop exercise, which might be interesting, probably on a more personal basis, for those, that's how you spend your Friday night, is to think about if your company was bigger or smaller, how would you do that? How could the size of your organization or how your organization approaches something like this really affect that tabletop exercise? So not just think about yourself, right? It's one thing for me to go, okay, my teams need to make sure if we're using XZ, okay, step number 1, am I using this thing? Step number 2, what version? Step number 3, can we patch it, or is it are we using someone else's dependency? Okay, we'll take a step back and go, okay, well, if we had another team that could be helping us give us that information, how could they improve that maybe for us plus my peer teams? So in other words, is there a way to sort of, how do you magnify the effect of something like this and the learnings from it minimize the effect of the vulnerability, but maximize what you get out of it and how you actually make the company work better overall or make your team work better overall. So I think there's different ways to think about it like that, as well as just also pure empathy. If you're at, I don't know, who will I pick on? Red Hat. Imagine you're like an software engineer or a software manager, engineering manager at Red Hat, or hell, maybe even someone in marketing. I don't know. You pick your costume you want to wear, and something like XZ comes through. What does that look like for a company with, I'm guessing, 10,000 software developers, or probably way bigger? And I think that's interesting to think about. Like, how do you deal with that? How many people are chasing their tails? How many separate teams are actually trying to solve the same type of thing? What could you come up with either as an open source product or as someone working at that company, or hell, maybe even a startup to actually make that thing become better? Does that already exist out there? So I think there's different ways to think about it besides just like, how do I deal with this for myself?
So, I don't think I can add to that. You gave us a great list for all of our listeners out there. I want to forge ahead through different articles now. Sorry, trying to come up with a good segue. I pulled in an article about PuTTY. And PuTTY was one of those things, and when I look at an article, I'm like, oh, wow, I haven't used that in ages. An SSH client on Windows system. And this was, part of the problem was that this is, 20 years ago, I think, right? When they were talking about, was developed starting around 2001. And so this was an era where there was Cygwin, for those of you who remember that, or this is also before even Windows had a CSPRNG, or a cryptographically secure pseudo-random number generator. I just had to throw in a couple letters for there just to continue the theme. But what stood out to me is that I'm going to skip over what the problem is and skip to the cause. So the cause was that the PuTTY was using a deterministic method for generating private keys. And this is actually, the technique was secure. However, the technique even evolved into an RFC 6979. But this was, PuTTY started doing this around in early 2000s, 2001, 2002. This RFC came out in 2013. And over time, this method that PuTTY was using worked until they got to the point where they suddenly said, oh, look, we have 521-bit keys, and we're using a 512-bit hash as part of our primitive. So there are 9, making the math easy, there's 9 bits left over that happen to be 0. And apparently, I'm going on just what the articles are saying, after about 60 or so example signatures, it would be possible for an attacker to recreate the private key, which is a bad thing if you use PuTTY to generate a private key you're using to sign your software. Things like that, if you're dropping it into GitHub. So it was the type of thing for me that stood out. They were doing the secure thing from the beginning, but threat models change, designs change, and once they hit that 521-bit key, suddenly that secure primitive that they were using became insecure. So it's one of those lessons of security is a journey, which I feel terrible for saying cliches, but you got to save me. I'm going to have to throw it over to you while I go punish myself for that.
I'm looking for a way to squeeze in here. We care about your security.
Do we take it seriously?
Thank you. We take it seriously. The length of your encryption key, signing key. Yeah, I used PuTTY too back in the day. It's been a while because I managed to stay away from Windows. Yeah, and I think, again, coming back to the whole concept of the tabletop exercise is, this thing existing, in a way, if you think about it, is why we say, hey, don't roll your own encryption, or I'm not blaming PuTTY in this case, but like, this is why we say, hey, when those new RFCs come out and all these type of things, a lot of us got better things to be doing than reading, RFC. I hadn't even heard of that one, to be honest with you. No way. This surprises nobody. 6979 from 2013. Yeah, I need to be able to trust, if I'm doing encryption or signing, I need to be able to trust whatever it is I'm consuming, whether it's OpenSSL or pick your poison. And it's just, I think it was, I'm not saying it was wrong for PuTTY to be doing what they're doing. I think, you're an SSH client, that's sort of your space. But even for them, that tabletop exercise is, okay, well, there's new RFC out. And more unfortunately, in 2024, is that going to come out in an RFC, or is that going to come out somewhere else? Where do you look? Where do you keep track of these type of things? Where's your news feed, not like Mike and I and like looking for stories talking about in the news, but where's your news feed for, is there a new standard for how we're going to be doing padding or length of our encryption, our signing key, or which standard do we use, and on and on and on.
Yeah, and I think it was even, was it last week? I surprised myself, but you were the one who said it out loud. There was yet another OAuth RFC that was like, I have to pay attention to this too. So a lot of things are changing, and so we've got to pay attention. One of the things we pay attention to, as you mentioned, are news articles, and we have 3 related to kind of about vulnerability disclosures and how they're written. That's what I'm trying to go for here. One aspect that I pulled is LeakyCLI. This is from Orca Security, who a year ago, they were talking about how credentials can get leaked into logs in Microsoft Azure, essentially because they're sitting in environment variables. And they said, look, the same thing can all the CSPs, Azure, GCP, they were pointing out, this can also happen. But I'm reading through this and I'm more just thinking, okay, fine, it's a nice finding thing to talk about, but the point is, why are you putting credentials or secrets into environment variables? All these CSPs have a secrets manager, and that is the favored way. It's a good developer experience even using secrets managers. It's not like they're really hard. You have to wait for the planets to be in alignment, the moon to be, waning or something bizarre. I'm trying to come up with some good astrology strangeness, and my brain is hurting just trying to think about that. But that was a takeaway kind of for me. And then you had 2 other articles about kind of perhaps a good and bad, or maybe a good and fuzzy types of ways companies are talking about, disclosures.
Beware of the blood moon when the wolf cries. We talked about this one a little off air, and I don't see that they're there. On this is specifically on, and we're big fans of Orca. But this is the standard. To me, this is a standard problem with just if you're going to be using, we'll say scripts in general, then automated scripts, and then build scripts in like a CI/CD system like GitHub Actions or Pick Your Poison. They mentioned Travis CI as well. It doesn't really matter which one you use. But I think GitHub has a pretty good number of checks nowadays that if you are going to put something like this in there, it's going to start screaming at some point. Maybe not always. Maybe you have to really sort of ham-fist it. But the point being, there's a lot of better ways to be doing this. And again, we're talking off air. It comes back to, how do you do this? How do you make it secure by default?
Right.
And if you look at, I'll pick on Google. If you look at Google's CLI tool, there's multiple different ways to get those creds in there. One is in my mind, there's a JSON file, which you can download and has everything in there because they have a little more stuff that's needed. But the point being here, no matter which one of these tools you pick of, AWS has the environment variables along with a dot file, and you can get really complex how you do dot files, and you can have different accounts and stuff like that in there. But maybe just take away the one that's broken. The reason they put those different ways in there is if the beginning user, the first time they're using this dumb tool, you want to make it's already complex. So you want to make it as easy as possible for someone, right? I'm sort of talking through the usability and the that side of things. But okay, we need to make it as easy. Is there some other way we can make it easy without having environment variables? Maybe the first time you use that tool, it says, "Hey, give me your credentials, and we'll store them somewhere safe for you," or like, you have to have an S3 bucket or somewhere else that you store them. So it's, a secret manager. Please don't quote me saying put your credentials into an S3 bucket. That's dumb.
Too late.
But you see what I say? And oh boy, I'm going to hear about that one. But yeah, there's, again, the end point being like, make it easier by default for people not to be doing those type of things. But if we look at these others that I had in here, let's see. Krebs on Security had an interesting one. This made the rounds last week. There's a company out there called Chirp Systems that their product is basically allowing landlords in, say, a condo building or apartment building to digitally control access, physical access. So the idea is you go and you put smart locks on your tenants' doors. You give them an app. That app lets them get in and out. And I haven't tracked it. I haven't gone looking yet, but there's one of the pluses here for the landlord is allows them to remove access to that unit, right? So there's a bit of sort of not good going on there in general, right? You don't pay your rent, suddenly your app doesn't work to get into your unit. That's there's something sketchy going on there. But so what they're doing here, Mike, is the app basically, when you click unlock or lock on the app for your apartment door, it goes and they've partnered with August Lock and Yale. I'll come back to that in a second because that was interesting. But it basically sends credentials over and says, hey, unlock the door. Cool, that, useful. Lots of ways you can do that with OAuth or different sort of standards out there. It seems is a keyword here. Our friends at Chirp, probably not our friends after listening to us, have decided to store those credentials in plain text in the app. Someone out there went and got the Android version of it. He not uncompiled, but he uncompressed the app, started looking around, saw there was this credentials file in there with stuff. We call this bad. Trademark Security Weekly. But so the interesting part here is the publisher, software publisher, is saying, no, we've looked at that. Or actually, the lock company is saying, hey, we looked at their app. We're not seeing anything wrong. We think it's okay. So there's a bit of he said, she said going on here. So we'll have to wait a few more days to see what's going on. But Krebs isn't just going to throw something out for pure hearsay. There has to be some there. But then the other aspect of this was, as I mentioned, the locks. So they work with August and Yale. I'm like, that's a really strange combination. I went looking at August, and they've got marketing now saying yeah, we're able to, our app works with Yale locks. And I'm like, why would a startup be working with a very established lock company? Oh, the parent company bought them, so they're both owned by the same company. So that's what's going on there. So you now have what I consider to be what is a lock startup. They might be pretty good, but still they're a startup, which has bad reputation to me security-wise as an industry, not as this company, that is suddenly working very closely with a very established, what second or third oldest lock companies out there. If not, can't remember which one, but they're one of the oldest. Might be oldest actually. But so okay, well that came as a surprise, but I think that's interesting. As these companies, as we go through economic up and downturns, or as these companies become older, the startups, they get acquired. They're going to get acquired by established companies, and suddenly you have a very well-known brand which might be using software which isn't quite as established. So that's going to be interesting to think about, sort of for IoT in general, not alone these locks. But yeah, well, I think we'll go have to watch this. The story itself we'll go have to watch for probably about a month just to sort of see what comes out of it. So Chirp is saying, there's nothing wrong, we don't need to fix it, there's nothing broken, and you've got someone saying, dude, there's plain text credentials. Those are pretty opposite ends of the spectrum, so we're going to have to meet somewhere in the middle at this point.
And then, sorry, I'll have to edit that out. There was a hanging up again, shakes fist in air. To continue on, there is also, there's one other vuln you picked out too, the sandbox escape in Flatpak. And there was a sense of complexity there. And I'm going to tie that maybe into an article I have about Chrome, which is not about vulns themselves, but about sandboxing and security. So let's start with this escape and why it stood out to you. Because honestly, I didn't notice this one, and it didn't catch my eye.
Yeah, so for folks who don't know, Flatpak is a relatively new standard. It's, I want to say 5 years old. It's a few years old, but it's a relatively new standard for how you package software packages on Linux. So instead of using trigger warning, RPMs or debs or APKs or whatever else it's out there, zip files or tarballs to install a software package on your system. Now we've got Flatpaks. And the idea here when it was created was, hey, we want to sandbox each app a little bit from each other, so both there's less dependencies between them. So if we, one version needs, an old version of OpenSSL for whatever reason, another needs a new version, someone's using Node, blah, blah, versus Node, some other version. There's different reasons, but they wanted to try and create a little playground for each app. As part of that, there was security promises around, hey, we're going to specify that the publisher says these are the things they need to access on the system. So like what we see on mobile devices nowadays. So they had some reasons why they did this. From my point of view, old school, crotchety Unix guy, I'm like, why do we have another packaging system out there? But that's my problem. So in this particular case, someone found a sandbox escape in this. So what's going on? They've got this whole, as you can see on this page, it gets it starts simple and it starts getting not complex like the crypto stuff we we're just talking about, but so there's a flatpak run command. Then you pass in the command you want to run. Then you specify which package you want to run this command on. Okay, cool. And someone's figured out that with that command, if you pass in like something like -- bind and some other thing, parameter, you start able to do things other than just run a command through that particular package. The parent system will start accidentally, it's not escaping it correctly, basically. So the parent system, which is calling that execute command to execute in the Flatpak, or in the container. Well, they'll say sandbox is, see, I told you it's complex. But it gets run by the parent, and all of a sudden you're suddenly passing a command line arguments to the parent process instead of to the child. And that's what ends up giving you the ability to escape out of that sandbox. It's a little, okay, fine, that's patchable. They found it. I know about it because they found it and patched it. But the problem with these things for me is, besides some other thing in Old Man with a Cane, is when you make these things more complex like this to try and do these cool things, unfortunately, that's when we start seeing security issues. So part of the thing here for me was just, and I know they're trying to put a desktop, so they work with, I think they say 38 different Linux distributions. Yes, there's 38 different distributions out there, but they work with a few different Linux desktops. And basically, because I think what's going on is, as you start supporting Linux UIs, you have to get more complex and pass more parameters and blah, 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 blah. So it's not just their own fault, but it is, the thing here for me is, how do you make this simple so it's testable and you don't have to worry about some of these edge cases? And that was, I don't want to say missed here, but that's unfortunately what happens when you make an application like this.
Yeah, I think listening to, like, is it securable, or can it have a secure design? It just comes to my mind as you're talking through this. And that's where I'd be, let's talk about this, write this diagram. Let's talk about how this is put together to figure out just how much of this complexity is going to weaken us and be scary versus how much of this complexity can be controlled or isolated. But enough about that. I did want to riff off that sandbox aspect because there was an article about a browser of all things. And this was just Google's introducing the Chromium Enterprise Plan. Basically, for $6 per user per month, you can get better malware protection. I may be glossing over a couple things, but this article, the thing that stood out for me is that, here is charging for security features. And better malware to which is what is is how that's phrased on the website. They also talk about DLP. I can kind of see DLP. That's an enterprise feature that maybe someone would pay for. But for me, this was kind of leading into that SSO tax idea of why charge people for OAuth or OIDC connections, being able to have strong authentication. These should be these should be baseline capabilities. And actually, in the previous segment, John, you had mentioned you've pitched to VCs security ideas, security solutions. So I wonder, from your perspective, how are you reacting to an article like this? Is better malware protection worth $6 per month per user? Should we be charging that?
Mike, this is the new front line of defense for organizations. So, yeah, This is, and I was just being a horrible person and checking to see if the person who wrote this used to work at Microsoft, because this feels like it's been heavily marketed, or maybe this has the feel of Microsoft, and I just mean that as a statement, not good or bad or anything else. You look at their marketing. You look at hell. You don't have to look at their marketing. Look at their quarterly calls for the investors, their investor calls, and they're talking about, yes, we have pivoted the company to make money off of security, and they are making a ton of it, right? And so that, I think, is partially what's going on here. Is there's a market for, obviously for security in general. We get to be here and talk to you folks week after week, but also for these larger organizations, not just to secure their software, because that, let's be honest, by itself, as probably some of our listeners know, that is what's called a cost center, right? We're having to pay money for application security, right? That's application security for most users out there is not generating revenue. We're just trying to keep the damn boat afloating. But if you take that and you can figure out how to market that as an advantage and like as an upsell, you can now charge for that thing that you've been spending money on. And instead of just breaking even, you suddenly now have a profit center, which is, from a business point of view, it's great, right? I mean, that's what as you mentioned, all those startups that we've been in do, Mike. It's we come up with an idea, we see an area which we think is not being, where we think it's not being addressed, or we think we have a better way to address it, or faster or cheaper, one of those variables, and we go beg someone for money to build a company out of it. Sometimes they give us money, and then we go and build a product. We try and convince customers to buy it, and we eventually get acquired by someone bigger, usually, not always, but and instead the enterprise play on that is there's some team over at Google in this case that we're working on stuff, and I'm guessing at one of their, I mean, a lot of the large tech companies have been going through some level of belt tightening, I'll say, over the last year or two, right? Either layoffs or killing products or whatever have you. And I'm sure someone at some level at Google was looking and going, damn, those 0-day dudes we have, they're great people, but man, they cost us a lot of money. Is there some way we could possibly, like, could we sell that to our customers, or is there something we can do to break even, or like, what's the benefit we're getting from this? I know we're getting marketing and our name out there, but how can we actually like minimize that spend that this is causing us? We don't want to fire those people. And one of the solutions they came up with is, hey, let's go have a chat with the marketing department. And next thing you know, we've got a new front line of defense for our organizations. And that's what's going on. So is it a good thing or a bad thing? I think the tricky part here is, yeah, it's sometimes particularly for the ones you mentioned, Mike, like DLP and things like that. The small company, the startup, or the mom and pop shop, they give zero about DLP, right? A lot of these things are just like, you want to copy and paste my stuff? Merry Christmas. There's, here, let me give you a USB drive. And then when you get into these larger organizations that they're like, we can't have our intellectual property going out the door or something, there's suddenly value on that. And they're going to either pay Google or some other startup to, just for the pure sake of, and I don't think this is controversial, probably is though, they're not going to prevent DLP. They're going to try and prevent data loss prevention, because this is one of those things, anyone who's tried to do this, it's massively difficult. How do you stop someone from trying to, take a Word document out of the company? Okay, you can stop uploads, you can do some different things, you can turn off Apple sharing like my company does. But at the end of the day, if I want to take like a piece of paper or like the information of something out of a building, good luck. So there's a bit of that aspect of it, unfortunately. But so the point here, as I ramble on, is I get there is, I'm open to them charging for some security features. Okay. Is there a bit of SSO tax going on? Yes. Is it being heavily marketed and sort of taking that big old marketing brush? Yeah. Is that a bad thing? No. I mean, sometimes you have to, and it comes back to the thing with Mark, is like the question I asked them towards the beginning is, it's not just the engineer to actually build the stuff and figure out how Zap is an awesome product. How do you get people to sponsor, or not sponsor, to fund that? And then B, how do you get people to realize they need to pay money to buy this thing? And that's sort of what they're doing here. So is an extreme, are a lot of our listeners going to be laughing, oh my God, they're going to put security into a browser and try to charge us for it? Yes. Is there a lot of folks out there going, oh, I trust those guys, they've done really great security work for many years. If they're going to put a little more effort into it and give me a better browser, I'd spend on that, right? So there's people having both sides of that conversation. I hate saying it, but yeah, it'll be interesting to see, will this be around in a year or two? One of the unfortunate problems with Google is they're very well known for killing products. It's great that they throw something out there and try it, so we'll see if this survives the test of time.
Well, eventually they'll add chat support to the browser as well, and then we know it's a pure Google project. Thank you for that. Now, your brain has definitely been working today. You've been giving us some great insights, John. One last article that I'm going to bring in here is going to put up your human intelligence against artificial intelligence. So this was an article that I appreciate the headline. No, LLM agents cannot autonomously exploit one-day vulns. Of course, my only complaint about this article is really that I would have titled it, "Do LLMs Dream of Exploited Heap?" just because I wanted the Philip K. Dick reference. But what I do appreciate is that there's a lot of hyperbole, and I think you and I both eye roll and avoid articles that are talking about hyperbole of AIs and that, oh, cool, you have some fancy if statements or some ML. That's, kind of banal. It's nothing too exciting. This is pointing out that some of these papers that are saying like, wow, breathlessly, look at it exploiting vulnerabilities it's never seen before. Actually, it's connected to the web. It's able to search. It's able to see, oh, this is how some PHP code was an exploit proof of concept was written for this vuln. Now, I'm not going to be completely dismissive because even as the article points out, LLMs are pretty helpful. It's pretty cool to be able to say, write me an exploit for a PHP SQL injection. And it has been trained on tons of models or tons of data that have examples of PHP exploit code, so it can spit that out for you. Or it can say, tell me what the exploit is from this CVE. It can go read, interpret that CVE, figure out this is a directory traversal, something like that. So there's utility as assistance, but we definitely don't have the cliche of the bots are here to take over everything. And I think that the other reason I'm highlighting this is it's a good precursor to see what's going to happen this year at DEF CON with the AI Cyber Challenge that DARPA and DEF CON are putting together. And we'll see, is AI just doing some better guiding on fuzzing because the AI isn't going to get bored where humans will, or is it going to do something novel or quote unquote emergent capabilities that everybody's looking for? So that's what got my human brain thinking, let's fight against the machines, John. What did you think about this?
Something just caught my attention here in his list of vulns is apparently there's a new vuln out in Run C at the beginning of the year, which I hadn't recognized or hadn't heard of. So I'm going to have to go back and look into that one and see what their latest thing is there. Where do we go? The first thing I'm realizing is like as I start to talk at working with my friends, and I start doing my rainbow hands every time I mention AI,
Yep.
I'm getting more and more weird looks. Because it's starting to come up more and more in like everyday conversation, right? And like when I do rainbow hands to my father-in-law, they're like looking at me like going, is he joining a dance troupe? No, we're talking about AI. And this is, I think this has been on my mind a little bit recently. I think it's going to, I hate saying like, let's see where this goes, but in this one in particular, if you think about, the last 18 months, we've had a few folks. One person was at Google, I think, who had to be let go. I think it was either Google or Microsoft. There was a fellow out there who, I'm pretty sure it was a fellow, but there's someone out there who was, they had believed that the LLM had become sentient.
That was the Google, yes.
And I think they let him go. And that's just one example, but there's people out there who have, I don't want to say drank the Kool-Aid, they have believed the magic what they're looking at, and they're like, oh my God, this thing does understand me. And then the rest of us are going like, are you out of your mind? It's math. So there's a chance there where I'm saying, that, let's see where it goes. I'd put a 10-15% chance in 2 or 3 years they're going to figure out that I was wrong, he was right. Or probably we all were wrong and he was right. And I think that's even just the chance of that all happening. I wouldn't say it's 0. I'll say it's 5-10% chance of it. So that in and of itself is just interesting to leave that for the philosophers out there. But from our point of view on this one, yeah, I don't in a million years think these things have the ability to go and exploit stuff. I think what's interesting, what comes to my sort of the hacker brain in me is, hey, does an LLM exist that can do that? No, let's go and build that and sell it. I think a lot of organizations out there would pay quite nicely to a LLM which is tuned to surf the web and look for vulnerabilities, and as soon as it finds them, figure out from its other parts, which it has, there I go, hand waving, but figure out how does it use that vulnerability to exploit something. Maybe it says, maybe they've got, I mean, I could see building this. Okay, there's new vulnerability out in Google Chrome Enterprise with whatever they call it, DLP solution. So there's a new vulnerability out in that. It sees that, it downloads a copy of the software which it sees is vulnerable, and then it just starts fuzzing until it figures out what the vulnerability is, and then it either packages and sells it, or it starts offering it as a service to people to. None of these are good things, don't get me wrong, but still someone's willing to pay money for it. I think that's interesting. But yeah, I think the vast majority of our listeners here know that. I think the interesting thing is, do we know how to communicate that to others? The problem is when you try to break down, from my experience, when I try to break down to a layman how AI works, and like I would say to him, it's just math, and like you'll see the eyes go like, what are you talking about? They're thinking like 2 + 2 or something like this. Like, no, and if you actually try to walk them through how these things work, that takes time. So how do you hold their conversation? How do you hold their attention while you're doing that over a cocktail or whatever have you? And I think that's the interesting part here is like, we talk about communication a lot, but in this is a new, really complex thing, especially when they're being done at these scales of, terabytes of data being fed through these things. So how do you explain that to someone of like, look, this really isn't magic. This is how this works. I think that's the takeaway for me. How do you, I struggle with that, even though it's something that I talk about relatively often. But yeah.
Yeah. There's definitely a leap between the autocomplete of sending text messages versus the autocomplete of writing out some, structural, some skeleton code from a function definition, which, as again, it can be useful. And I think the one thing I want to add here to sort of tie everything together, even from our last segment, Metasploit has been around for 20 so years, and that is a way for humans got together and ways to exploit known vulnerabilities. And it was also then taken on by Rapid7. So you had that open source beginning, you had some commercialized support for it, and it is really how to exploit vulns. Now, it's not doing 0-day or 1-day vulns, but it's a quick follow. So I think I just wanted to highlight that, is that there's already ways for users to take advantage of exploiting vulnerabilities. We don't need LLMs to make that worse. It can be a time saver, but it's not like we need to introduce new controls. We have a whole new discipline of InfoSec.
But would it be worse or would it be better? If we had something out there where as a community or a country or world, we knew that like as soon as a vulnerability is found, there's a robot out there trying to figure out how to kill you, would that get people to write better code finally?
We got to end it there. That's going to be our new question. Lead with fear. We've come full circle. I love it, John. Thank you.
Come on.
And everybody knows that he is joking and smiling as you say this. But thank you, John, for joining me. Thanks, everyone out there. Please do remember to subscribe, whether or not you are a Gen AI or a human. Do share on the socials. Check out the show notes. And speaking of scary things, check out Falling by Sung. We'll see you next time on Application Security Weekly.